Hi, my name is Marcus, and this is a companion podcast for the C.G. Jung Helpdesk meetup group. I host live events on Zoom every 2 weeks about the concepts and ideas of the Swiss psychologist Carl Gustav Jung. Every event, I give a presentation about the Jungian concept, so have fun with this event's topic.
All right, I want to welcome you all to this event's topic, which is Jung's thoughts and ideas about children. Something that is not so well known, but he has written about, and there are even specific books I can point towards, which is quite nice to have a topic where Jung stays on topic, because he really likes to go off on tangents and tries to combine everything all the time. And there's one book from the collected works, which is called The Development of Personality. And this is on the papers on child psychology, education, and related subjects. So this is a really good introduction if you want to read something on Jung's idea. It's also not so thick, but super interesting that Jung talked and thought about many, many different things. And developmental psychology was also something of that. So Jung participated in the beginning of psychology when it was a new science and a really new field. And he dipped his toes in many, many different topics. So I was surprised and at the same time not so surprised that he also wrote extensively about developmental psychology, I would call it today. So how children's psychology functions and is developing over time. And there's another book which was published only, I think, 10 years ago or something like this, and it's called Children's Dreams. This one is a little bit bigger. And this deals with a seminar that Jung gave between 1936 and 1940, exclusively on the dreams that children have. And of course, he dabbles there in the psychology of children. And it's super interesting. So if you're interested in dream psychology, I can also highly recommend it because it's one of the few books where he actually explains how he analyzes dreams, which he does not do in the collected works. We only found out about this much later. He talks about it mainly in the seminars. Yeah, so what does Jung talk about when he talks about children and their psychology? We have to call into our memory how Jung sees the psyche. And in the psyche, Jung sees two very big areas. And one is consciousness, and one is the unconscious, sometimes labeled the subconscious, not by Jung, but by others. He calls it always very clearly the unconscious. And this is because there's a relationship between consciousness and the unconscious, because everything that is not in consciousness is the unconscious, which is a lot of stuff, because consciousness is basically everything that you know, that you can do, that you can perceive willfully and attentively. So things that you notice and that spring into your eye, and also that you can do in a controlled manner. You can drive a car in a controlled or an uncontrolled way, and only one of those ways is conscious and also healthy. And this unconscious is very big in general, and consciousness is what is unique quirk to human beings, that we have something as consciousness, that it is like a net that is perceiving but also remembering stimuli that are coming from outside or inside. So for Jung, memory is an important part of consciousness, the same as will, to actually willfully do things or not do them, which is a form of control, planned acting, and to have a kind of coherence between one's action, that you create a sense of self and of a coherent whole that is related everything to each other. When you have consciousness, everything is related to you, the ego, and I. And when you, for example, have a job interview, these are the things that you don't talk about. Or when you meet a new person, to say, oh, I like this, I'm working as this, I have done this, and so on. It's always this I and the connection to it. But of course, everything in the unconscious is not connected to the I, the ego, and also not connected in conscious in general, which is a lot. And this is what Jung says. We start out as human beings when we are born, as children. There is no consciousness yet. There is no ego. There is no will. Small children do not act willfully. They don't have a plan. They can't control themselves. They're pure emotions, impulses, and they just act. And you can see this for the first couple of years, that there's also no continuity of any kind. There's just acting, and it can change from second to second. Extreme emotion, extreme excitement, extreme sadness, extreme hunger, extreme tiredness. And it's only with time that something pops up and this is when the child sees itself as separated from everything else. And this is where the I develops, the ego, where it's, Jung says, basically discovered. This is something just that pops up into existence and consciousness starts to form around it. And this is around the time when children discover the word no and can exert their will and can see suddenly there's a separation between them and the things that are happening around them. And it is a slow, gradual process that you have the child developing will and developing consciousness, but it takes many, many years. This is why children are a long time in education, and it takes a long time for people to then actually participate in society and have their own life and also have their own personality, because in the beginning, everything is unconscious. Jung talks us about a lot in the sense of self. As he says, the self as a concept is everything that you could be, but this is the future. This is a potential. But the groundwork for the future is already in the unconscious, and one pulls it out and connects it to one's consciousness and one's ego. And this is what you can see when people evolve and develop, that they get a personality. There's a certain way how they see the world, how they want to act in the world, what they like, what they don't like, what preferences they have, if they are extroverted, if they're introverted, if they're more thinking or more feeling, or if they're very creative or very diligent. And this gets developed and clears out through time. This is what's pulled out of the unconscious and gets connected. It's like a big system where different parts get turned on over time, allowing for more complex behavior and a more complex personality. So the personality of the child is already there, but it is unconscious, it is dormant. It needs time to unfold like a flower. And this process for Jung does not necessarily stop with the age of 16 or 18. For him, that is a development that happens the whole life of a person, which he calls individuation, and the goal is the self. This is the everything that you could be. Your psyche is trying to push you and strives toward that. But in the beginning, we're staying with children, they're not all of that. They're just emotions, they're impulses, they are highly susceptible to things happening outside of them, and they are uncontrolled. And Jung says that's the case for all human beings. And he says also for human societies, humans as a species, that we have a consciously evolved and formed consciousness is something very new. For him, consciousness in the human history sense started with writing, when people really externalized things and they had to write something down, which is then again in a coherent manner, right? In a willful and planned manner. People don't write by accident. They don't learn reading and writing by accident. And he said, this is really when human consciousness started in the cultural sense. And from then on, a lot of the human endeavor was to really grow the consciousness of people. And this is education. This is being in schools. That is learning rules, following laws, acting in more complex societies. And this is fairly new. This human beings have not done this for so long. We can count it in thousands of years. But human beings existed for millions of years. And he was really interested in this state, this early state that he called primitive and primitive psychology, without that being a value judgment, but rather describing a state which is just early. We could call it maybe superstitious or pre-scientific in a modern context. And what Jung was interested in, then in children, of course, to see this seeds, this base operating system of human beings that is running in the background, that everything is built on top, not only in children, but also he visited a lot of native people that are, of course, removed from this cultural process of these complex societies and institutions and so on. So he traveled a lot to South Africa, to South America, to India, and so on, because he said this is not unusual, like this superstitious way of living and perceiving the world, to say everything is animated and there's certain ways you should behave, that dreams are real, and all these things, that this is still how we work deep inside. He said our conscious level, our cultural level is like a very thin crust that can easily be broken. For example, every time we're tired, we're angry, we're under extreme circumstances, And he saw this really breaking in his lifetime multiple times because he lived through the First World War and the Second World War, and said, yeah, the humanity that we have, this cultivated conscious layer, it is thin because it is very new. And he was interested in children because it was a gateway to really the deeper parts and deeper layers of the psyche. Because he saw, when you go deep enough in the psyche, that you hit a layer called the collective unconscious, which is there is an unconscious which is in every human being and is connecting everybody. We would call it human nature, where he would say, okay, there's things that just pop up all by themselves all the time. You have in all cultures, in all societies, you have religion, you have stories, and they have very often certain forms and structures and motives that just pop up. Like people like to tell stories, and it just happens to be always the same stories. They look different, but in their core and their structure, they're very, very identical. And this collective part is very foreign and hard to understand because it is very, very deep below. So he looked at children and especially children's dreams to understand what is happening there in collective unconscious. Because same as this primitive psychology, as he called it, the collective unconscious is still there and is acting on us and is pushing things up. He says this is where cultures come from and creative works of art and all these things. So what we like as humans, it is defined by the collective unconscious, by our human nature. And I have a quote for that where he describes this. Young children have a consciousness which is remarkable. I find the psychology of little children exceedingly difficult. Their dreams, for instance, are amazingly difficult. One would assume that they would be quite simple, but they are far from that. Of course, some are obvious, but they have an unusual number of great dreams and great visions too. And to deal with them requires a hypothesis which makes me quite dizzy. One has to assume that they have a consciousness of the collective unconscious, an amazing thing. So he says children are amazingly unconscious, and this means they're way closer to the collective unconscious. You see it in their dreams, in the way how they behave, and that this is how every human being inside also behaves, even though that they might not know it or not be aware of it or forgot it or deny it. There's still this old psychology in there. And he calls children really not blank slates, which is also a stream of, let's say, philosophy that human beings come into the world as blank slates and you can teach them and bring them in any form you want through education. Because it might look like this when you have small children. You can tell them everything, you can make them do things. But as I said, for Jung, there's a personality already there, and this personality wants to express. Same as you have handedness, right? It's very hard to change the handedness of people, and people tried. I'm left-handed, for example. I could have not gotten into school 50 years ago in Germany and older because they would have tried to make me write with my right hand. Of course, we stopped that, but it just goes that human beings, they have a preference that's already there. And they are mainly unconscious about themselves. They need to explore themselves. And this is what life journey is about. When children are born from a mother and father and come into a family, Jung looked very closely at these dynamics because for Jung, he worked as a therapist, a psychologist. When he had a patient, he would not only look at the patient themselves, but rather he said, okay, they're ingrained in a kind of network of other people. How are the people around them? How do they react to his patient? And of course, he then saw a lot of family relationships, either with the parents of the patient or with the partner and the child of the patient. And this is where he noticed a lot of stuff. And one thing that a lot of people are aware of is how people that are related to each other, that they look very similar, that there's certain features that pop up from time to time in a family tree. When you look in a family tree and you know a lot of your relatives, like sisters, brothers, nephews, nieces, aunts, and uncles, and there are certain just physical traits that come up, like, oh, there's a certain height, there's a certain ear, there's certain eyes or nose. And there's some traits that seem to skip certain generations that suddenly, oh, he looks like his grandfather or great-grandfather. Especially now that we have a lot of pictures of people, especially when they were younger, it's quite eerie. Like I also have people in my family that look identical to people a couple of generations back. And Jung said, this is well known and everybody understands it, but he says the psychology is the same. There's a composite happening, not only physiologically, but also psychologically. That there are some psychological traits within a family, that there is a family psychology. And it is this building blocks that get reassembled basically every time when a child is born in a family. And this is a point he makes very clear. He says the child is never really the child of the mother and father, but it's a child of the families of the mother and the father. And this is pretty clear, and I think everybody knows it, that children are very different from their parents. But if you look at the family tree, you can say, oh yeah, it seems to be belonging together somehow. That the child is combining in them the psychology of both families. And Jung even makes a statement that if those psychologies are very different, the psychology of the child can be troubled by that. He does not really specify what that means, but he says that a child can basically suffer for being the child of two families. As I said, there's a kind of family psychology, a family spirit that gets incarnated in form of the child. And he talks about when you have specific neurotic family members, like black sheep, he says, oh, those are mostly the closest to the family spirit because they are possessed by the family psychology and have very little of their own individuality. And says people suffer from that when they can't really live their own life, but are burdened by external forces. For example, archetypes, right? Or emotions. When this unfolding of the personality through individuation that's supposed to take place cannot really take place because they are overwhelmed in their consciousness. It cannot develop as it should be. And while people very often look to outside forces to say like, oh, I can't develop as I want to because of my family or society or job or whatever, or the law, Jung says the same is also true psychologically. Like that people are taught by emotion and neurosis and archetypes that drive their lives and prevent them from developing as they should be and become an individual, to become a coherent whole. And neurosis is a very good point because it says families not only have a psychology, but also they have neurosis. There is generational trauma that can be propagated through different generations that are given through the parents to the child. And as you can also see in some families, that there's a struggling happening that just propagates through the generations until somebody says, okay, I want to break out of it. It has to be a conscious, willful choice and also a lot of effort to move beyond that. But this is what it takes to become an individual and become oneself. So this already goes pretty far. I wanted to start with the start of life. So when the child is born, with this already in place psychology in a sense that will unfold over time, it first will be not itself, but rather an extension of the psychology of the mother. This is what Jung noticed a lot. The same as a child is an extension of the body of the mother. Right? It's growing out of the body of the mother. The psychology is also first completely entrenched and connected to the psychology of the mother. And this is, of course, the great task of children when they grew up, then later in life, to get out of this family psychological atmosphere and to become their own persons. This is what Freud dealt with. Freud dealt with the people in the beginning of their life that should go out of the basement of their parents but don't want to. And they suffer for it because in the background, there's still the personality, there's still the life, there's a self, and it's pushing the person out. And if it does not want to do it, it suffers, gets neurosis, it clings to this infantile state. It does not want to do anything self-sufficient in the world. And the person becomes neurotic. And of course, in the beginning, this is just how it is. The child is still freshly born and freshly new. And it is an extension of the psychology of the mother. And to an extent also of the psychology of the father. This is what he talks about really a lot. That the psychology of the parents have a huge influence on the child. And it is way more influential as than what the parents are saying. He says what parents do or any educator does is way more important to the child than what they say. Saying and speaking is very often a conscious thing, but what we do and what we act is also very unconscious. So the things we do not want to have slip out, very often they show themselves in our actions. This is why the saying goes, watch the hands, not the mouth. And he says, and this is already pretty smart parental advice, the child will follow what it sees and perceives there. And he says children are very, very perceptive. And this is because the unconscious as a thing is also very perceptive. The same as consciousness can see things and react to those things. He says the unconscious also sees things and reacts to those things. Something that Freud, for example, said, when we dream of something, the biggest influence what we see in a dream is what we've perceived the day before we slept. But it's those things that we maybe shortly perceive and immediately forget. And they sneak through the back door into our psyche and our unconscious and stay there. There's the things that we immediately forget, that we have thousands of millions of impressions every second, every minute, all day. There's always stuff in the background that's only there for a very short moment, and it's all gets collected in the unconscious and then comes out during dreaming. In the same way, children react to these things that they perceive, and they can not really control them. That makes them very honest. And they're perceiving in a big part to the psychology of the parents. So everything Jung says that the parents in themselves have not taken care of, their shadow, the part where they do not want to go, and they have not dealt with their neurosis, their trauma, their unsolved things. It all will play out in the child first. He says this multiple times, that children are living out the unlived life of parents. So everything that parents have not taken care of in themselves, in their life, in their psychology, in their development, it will catch the child immediately, and it will be a kind of possession. This will be then the same as an archetype or an emotion gripping the child. It will define the life of the child, and of course make it neurotic, because again, it's not then the child's life, but rather the unlived life of the parents that is trying to express itself. And this is why he makes a statement that he says children can never be neurotic, because they don't have a reason for a neurosis. Jung saw neurosis really as a kind of healing mechanism. The same way when you have a virus infection, that your body temperature rises and you get a headache and all those things. The temperature rising and the headache and the stuffy nose and coughing, that's not the disease. The disease is the virus, and all those symptoms are there to kill the virus. And Jung sees the psyche in the same way. A neurosis is a healing attempt. It is there to make the person aware of something that they do not want to be aware of, or they are not aware of, but should be. So it is like heat coming up, and you have to ask yourself, okay, why I'm so hot? Oh, maybe I'm ill. But psychologically is, oh, why am I without any energy, and why am I unfocused, and why can't I live my life normally? Oh, there's maybe something I have not done that I should have done. This is Jung's idea about how the psyche works and how the unconscious pushes things to us, how the self, our future us, is pushing things to us. And this is why he said when children act neurotic, this is not the neurosis of the child, because the child has no disconnect yet. The disconnect is very, very often associated with a consciousness, which is adapted and evolved in a wrong or incomplete direction. And children do not have yet this kind of developed consciousness. And he would say, okay, the first thing he would look at when you would see a neurotic child would be the mother, as the child is an extension of the psychology of the mother. And he then would very closely look into the life of the mother and the parents and how they are and whether they have a problem. And he would notice when he would solve the problem of the parents, the symptoms of the child will disappear. Because again, the child is not willfully doing anything. It is close to the unconscious, and the unconscious is reacting to what it is perceiving. And the perceiving is this unresolved problems and this unresolved trauma. He very often would also use this as a diagnostic tool. When you, for example, would have a father as a patient, he would talk to the child and ask the child what they're dreaming. The ideas of Jung regarding dreams are very complex and pretty far, so I can highly recommend the episode that I did on there. But the basic idea is really that the unconscious is reacting to consciousness and is trying to make consciousness aware of the thing that is not aware of. And the child then perceive those things, and the same things constellate in their unconscious and express themselves then also in their dreams. And Jung would do that pretty often, to look in the vicinity of people with psychological problems, what kinds of dreams they would have. And this seems to be that it was not unusual, because he had one colleague who really would do that, to bring patients to their villa, and they were living remotely, and let them stay there overnight, and then talk to their own family that was living there, and also the housekeepers, about their dreams that they have in the night. Because your unconscious is incredibly perceptive. It's like the collective wisdom of human beings in the background, this collective part that has seen everything. When something is in the collective unconscious, it means it happens so often as a pattern, as a situation, that it became ingrained genetically in human nature to watch out for that and perceive that. That is why you can react in very dangerous situations so quickly. It's not you willfully saying, oh, I will now move to the side, but rather your body, your psyche is already acting before you notice that. And you have this really in extreme situation. So similar, the unconscious is very perceptive and would push then in dreams and other people what other people in their vicinity should dream. Because he would do that mainly when people would have not dreams on their own, even though they should have. And then he would poke around and find it in the children that, of course, are living out the unlived life of the parents. And there I have a very nice quote. A man usually treats the children as he treats the woman and as he treats his own feelings. This goes back to the idea, okay, how complete are you as a human being, and how are you taking care of the things that are already inside of you? And Jung has this idea about projecting, which means everything you do not take care of in yourself, and you don't want to see, and you don't want to engage with, that you see it projected in the outside world. He said in primitive psychology, this was just how people were, because they were very unconscious, so that saw their own psychology in the outside world. They see gods and just animated things and rocks and rivers and the sky. And this still happens to us, that when we don't want to see or associate ourselves with certain things, that we perceive them outside the more. Because our unconscious, again, tries to steer us in that direction and say, like, hey, pay attention to that, do something with that. But of course, the reaction is of course negative, like, oh, I hate that person or this thing. People don't want to engage with that. And this is how they keep their malformed, maladapted consciousness. So for Jung, just mother and father themselves, and this is a big topic, and there was a huge disagreement between him and Freud. For Freud, the mother and father complex, so the baggage basically people get from their parents, consciously or unconsciously, is defined by the actual parents, the actual mother, actual father. But again, we're talking about Jung, and he says certain situations and experiences, when they happen often enough, they are in the collective unconscious. And of course, having a mother and father is something archetypal. This is the truth for all human beings that ever existed. Which means the idea of a mother and father is already there. There's a kind of reference point. There's already an idea in the child how a mother and father should be. And of course, a deviation from that ideal causes then also potential stress to the child and can create problems there. Because it's not like when a child only knows a mother, that it does not have an idea what a father is, but rather it has a very clear idea what a father is, but only in this archetypal, abstract, eternal way, but not in this concretized, as a real person, father way. And you can see that in people, for example, when they grow up without a father, that they try to find the father figure somewhere else. I have friends like this, that they're suddenly interested in certain personalities very often in public life in an, let's say, very extreme way, because there is this need and to express this father archetype somewhere, to find it somewhere. And of course, this can have his whole lot of other problems that can be created by that. Yeah. 1 second. So when we look into children and we look into education, and I talked about it in the sense of, an educator or parent should be aware of the things they have unsolved in their own psyche, because it's not gone. It's not gone from their own life, but it's also deeply affecting their children. This is the number one advice he gives to educators, like, okay, deal with your unresolved things. How to basically help and educate children. And he talks a lot about then fairy tales, of course, because it's Jung. He likes stories, mythological, religious, spiritual, occult, and also fairy tales, because for him, these are codifications of this collective unconscious. This means these experiences that are eternal and are coming up all by themselves have to manifest themselves somehow, because it's strange. It's like a completely strange situation. It's, let's say, in the outside world, because it's always easier to understand. In an outside world, an archetypal situation is always like, okay, you want to find a partner, right? And you're on your first date, for example. Or you become a parent yourself, or you come into a new group, or you join a company, which would be a modern thing, but goes back to this idea of being in a group or being in danger and all these things. This is archetypal outside, but also inside things can come up which are archetypal, like this idea of the shadow or the anima or the self, or just certain patterns that repeat themselves, that put people on rails. And to express and to digest these things, he says fairy tales show the relationship between certain concepts. So for us, it's pretty clear that the Greek gods were expressing human emotions, and how Greek gods were related to each other showed how certain emotions are relating to each other and how they interact with each other. So it's already an exploration of psychology. For Jung, these stories, mythology, religion, spiritual, and so on, are exploration of the psyche. To say, okay, how does the psyche process things? How does the psyche evolve? What is happening there in the background? Is that this is why it's so important to give children fairy tales. And we have fairy tales that are hundreds of thousands of years old. And so, again, always the same stories. And people like them because they're expressing something and they're activating something in the psyche which is dormant or was dormant before. And the same way as children have fairy tales, he says, like, adults need a religious structure or spiritual structure, something that helps them order their life and order their emotions and the tasks that they need to do, to make sense of it, to really channel it. He sees it as when things come up, it's like a raw material. It needs to be transformed in something useful and good. Same as anger itself, it's emotion, it's archetypal, like everybody knows it. It comes all by itself. See it in children. Children are most of the time very angry. They even measured that. I saw a study somewhere that, for example, when the child wants its mother, which is perfectly normal for a very small child, and the father comes in, that the child starts to cry. Not because it's sad, because it's angry. And this anger, of course, stays with people their whole life. And what Jung was looking towards is, okay, this primal emotion that is always there, what are human beings doing with it? And you can learn how to control your anger, not to suppress it, but rather to channel it into certain things. For example, when you want to do things and be energetic or be competitive, for example, in sports, it's a very good thing if you can facilitate your anger in a productive, healthy manner that does not harm you and others in the long term. But being in a game, for example, and being in a competitive setting, like, anger is something very useful as long as someone is not losing their head. Same as you want to find a partner. There are, let's say, quick and illegal ways how to get sex with someone, and we throw people in prison for that for very good reason. But there's also courtship. There's a degree of sophistication that people are learning and that children are learning. And he says, to make sense and structure this is what stories are for. Not to indoctrinate children and saying, oh, this is how the world is and how you should perceive the world, but rather to structure and order the things that are already inside of them and that will come up. And he says, for human beings to grow up and learn a lot of things, and they cannot connect them yet. But with time, they will understand. I had this really strongly in in school, the German classes, we read a lot of German classics, and they do not make sense to children. There are a lot of books where I have to say, okay, it does not make sense that a child of 14 or 12 should read this book, not because it's a bad book, not because it's bad topics, but rather the life experience for understanding it is missing. So there needs to be kind of foundation. Again, this thing of connection, of consciousness. I need to have experienced certain things that make me wonder, and I say, okay, I don't know how to fit this puzzle pieces together. But then a story can come in, like an explanation, and say, and order it and make it suddenly make sense, like a stroke of insight. Like in a murder mystery, when the twist comes and it's revealed who the real murder is. You have all these strange, disconnected things in the beginning, but then comes this stroke of insight, and then everything falls into place. And this is how consciousness basically evolves, by accumulating things, but then restructure them constantly. And this is why children have to learn a lot of things that they can't make sense of, and being told, especially by their parents, a lot of things that they just follow as rules in the beginning. And it's important that they learn rules first to really foster consciousness. So Jung saw human beings as rule-generating beings. That's just what people like archetypically to do. But he saw there also the foundation of culture, because rules always means you need to consciously do things or not do things. You have to keep them in mind. So having a taboo, for example, not do things, that things are sacred and so on. He saw that really as a stepping stone to develop consciousness, because you have to pay attention and you have to watch your actions. You have to have this continuity. And this is why Jung's so interesting, because he's connecting really everything. Right? We're talking about the beginning of human civilization, and human beings, children, teenagers, they accumulate all these things. They can't make sense. And he says, this is what's happened in the second part of life, when people go past the age of 38 or 40, that they discover their inner world, that they discover culture, and they discover the meaning of things. Before it was field research, he calls that. And then there's really life beginning. Yeah, this is, of course, only after the children actually leave the children's psychology. But it would not be Jung, it would not be a little bit more complicated, because first, you are a child. You try not to be a child anymore. You try to be an adult. But he says at a certain point, you have to become a child again. And I have a quote for that. For instance, you remember in Symbol of Transformations, I say the Christian teaching is that you must sacrifice your own childishness. For how can you become like unto a child when you are still a child? First, you must overcome your childishness, and then, after you have been an adult, you can become a child again. This is very clearly the teaching of Christ. For Jung, life and living experience is always this oscillating between poles. So you should always go there where you are not currently. So what is your strong suit? You should go to the weak suit. It's always oscillating between things, between opposites, between poles, to then find a middle path and become complete. And this is where I would end my presentation, with these words. And I want to thank you for your attention. And I hope you learned something. Yeah, I'm now very curious about your thoughts and your ideas about the things that Jung said about children and childhood and development.
This was this event's topic. Thanks for tuning in. During an event, a discussion part follows after the presentation, where all attendees discuss the just presented topic or other Jungian concepts. If you also want to join, find the group on meetup.com. The name of the group is CG Jung Helpdesk. Also make sure to subscribe to the podcast on the platform of your choice. See you next time.